And it looks like we are live streaming. We'll just double check that to make sure the public is able to view and participate, and then we'll give it a minute and get started. Yep, it looks like we are live streaming. So, Lindsay, is there anything else you need to take care of, or are we ready to start sharing the screen and get going?
We're all ready to go.
All right, everybody. So I'm going to call us to order. We're ready to get going. We want to go ahead with our logistics screen.
Lindsay, are you sharing your screen?
Sorry about that. I can.
There we go, much better. So good morning, everybody. My name is Jason Myers. I'm an administrator over at LDEQ in our Airplane Assessment Division. I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting here. I'm joined by my co-chair, Mr. Tim Hardy. So, hey, Tim.
Yes.
So just go over the meeting logistics real quick. Just be aware that we are recording this meeting, and this meeting is being broadcast to the internet on YouTube for public viewing. We ask you to please leave your camera on and be present during the meeting. If you could, please provide your affiliation and your Zoom name. That way, that'll help either identify you to whenever you're speaking for whoever may be watching. A few months ago, I'd be asking you to put your phone on mute, but now that's back in the day. So in our virtual world, we're going to ask you to keep yourself on mute, your Zoom on mute while you're not speaking. If you have any technical issues, you can send a chat in the chat box. Our governor's office folks, either Lindsay or Harry, will take care of that for you. If you have any questions, we ask that you just hold them to the end of each agenda item, because you know it gets pretty complicated there when everybody's trying to talk at the same time on a Zoom. And as far as a meeting disruption, if a meeting is disrupted, or if we have a Zoom bomb, which I didn't know what that was just a few minutes ago, it means somebody interrupts us, then we will discontinue this call and just reschedule at a later time. So for those watching on YouTube, you can submit public comments both during and after our live stream. We have one final agenda item that we will wait a few minutes for people to finish up on their comments. You can email that to comment@la.gov. And then your subject line, please include Manufacturing Industry Committee and an agenda item, if you can remember what agenda item you are looking for. Also submit, please include your name and address in your comment. So moving on, I think I'd like to get us going here. I think first off, we'll get to our agenda. So here's our agenda. Everybody should have received a copy of that in their Zoom invitation, and also it's displayed here if not. So first off, we'd like to say if we can have a motion to accept the agenda and also a second.
So move. Tim
Gray
Hurd.
Stream will second.
Keisha Collins. Oh, okay.
And any opposition to that? Comments? Yay? Okay, so we'll accept the agenda. So as you can see, first off, we're going to go with our roll call. And we can go just down the list. You want me to do the roll call?
Sure.
So go ahead, roll call. I'll just go down the list. Me, Jason Myers, I'm present. Lindsay there. Tim Hardy, co-chair.
Present.
We have Gray. Not sure who.
Present. Gray Stream.
Thank you. We have Soupy Dallender.
Oh, Jason, there's some additional folks who are not on the committee that are just listening in that are helping facilitate. But we can, Lindsay, do you want to just run through the roll call?
Yes, Jason, I can do that for you guys.
Okay.
I'll stop
Thank you.
screen sharing real quick so I can pull up our list. So members, as I call your name, please just unmute yourself and then note that you are here. So we'll start with our co-chairs, Jason Myers,
Present.
Timothy Hardy,
Present.
Takesha Collins Wright,
Present.
Morris Johnson,
Present.
Grace Stream,
Present.
Margot Moss,
Present.
Roman Hardy, Daniel Schantz,
Present.
Nathan Mcbride,
Present.
Zen Saunders,
Present.
Hunter Johnston,
Present.
Mary Lee Orr,
Present.
and Scott Anderson.
Present.
Thank you, members. I'll go back to sharing my screen, and we do have a quorum.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me, according to our agenda, I'll just make a few welcoming remarks. This is Tim Hardy. I must say, this is an awesome membership of this committee. I will not go over the entire executive order, but I think it's clear to this committee, our ultimate goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the strategy of accomplishing that. I will just mention by 2005, we're to reduce net greenhouse gases by 26 to 28% levels as compared to those of 2005. By 2030, we're to reduce net greenhouse gases between 40 and 50% based upon those levels in 2005, and ultimately with the goal by 2050 of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. The governor spoke, and although at first blush by some this might sound daunting, it is what's being accepted generally around the world. We have some challenges in Louisiana that are unique to Louisiana, but we have an opportunity to be a leader in this process. I do want to say that in accomplishing this, we want to not only try to meet the goals, but do it in a way that's sensitive to the economic climate of Louisiana, with also respect and special attention to communities that will be impacted by actions that we might consider in an equitable type way. So this is exciting. The membership is, I think, fantastic. We have members from industry. We have members representing academia. the scientific community, and also members representing the interest of those communities with a view toward equity. So all of the committees are significant and important, but I would like to say this absolutely is one that I think will have a major impact on ultimately what we send to the governor. So again, welcome to everyone. This is going to be, I think, exciting. I think it's going to be pivotal. And as has been said, we look to reach consensus, have respect toward each other while we go through this process. And again, I welcome everybody here and look forward to working with each and every one of you. And at this time, Jason, do you have any further remarks?
I just will say one other thing. Again, my name is Jason Myers, Administrator of our Air Planning and Assessment Division here at DEQ. Part of our job here is to maintain our state implementation plan, or STIP plan as otherwise known. And this plan is essentially the state's method on how we are going to meet and stay in attainment with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the NAAQS. And I just want to mention that right now, the entire state is in attainment with all of our NAAQS, with the exception of 2 parishes, St. Bernard Parish and a portion of Evangeline Parish for SO2. And we're moving to have those parishes also meet attainment in the very near future. I think that's a very good testament to the way industry and the state has worked together in order to come about that. Because as you all know, we are a very industrialized state, and just to be able to be that close, and eventually we will be completed in a complete attainment, I think that is an amazing accomplishment, and we can use that same momentum to do what we have planned to do here. So see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces. It's nice to meet all of you virtually, and I hope we come up with some very good discussions, and at the end of the day, a very good plan. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jason. At this time, I'd like for each member of the committee to introduce themselves. I'll begin with myself. And please give your name and your affiliation, your area of expertise. My name is Tim Hardy. I'm the co-chair, member of the task force. I'm a former DEQ assistant secretary. I'm a former executive assistant to a governor for environmental affairs, currently an adjunct professor of environmental law, Southern Law Center, and I am a partner in the law firm of Brazil, Saxon Wilson, where I practice environmental law. Let me just add, I am the designee of the Senate President, and I really appreciate the honor of being designated and by the governor accepting that designation. At this time, I'd like to call the names of each member of the committee, and please introduce yourself as well. Next person I have on the roll is Akisha Collins Wright.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Akisha Collins Wright. I am the Vice President of Environmental Affairs and General Counsel for the Louisiana Chemical Association. LCA has spent the last 60+ years providing a unified voice for Louisiana chemical industry. The issue of climate change is an important one for us, and it's one that's important for our member companies as well. We really look forward to working with this committee and providing insight on the work that the chemical industry can do to help reduce the risk of climate change. Thanks for having me in this committee.
Thank you. Next is Morris Johnson.
Morning. Yes, my name is Morris Johnson. I'm the general manager at the CF Industries Donaldsonville Nitrogen Complex. Been in this role for about 4 years, but I've been with the company for more than 30. CF Industries is a leading global manufacturer of hydrogen, nitrogen products for clean energy, emissions abatement, fertilizer, and other industrial applications. As the world's largest producer of ammonia, CF recently announced our commitment to decarbonize our ammonia production network, which includes the Donaldsonville complex, which is the largest of its type in the world. Our goals are in line with the state. with a 25% reduction of CO2 equivalent on a per ton basis by 2030 and net zero by 2050. I appreciate the opportunity to be on this advisory committee and look forward to working with everyone and contribute to the work of the Climate Initiatives Task Force. Thank you.
Thank you. Gray String.
Hey, thank you. Also excited to be involved in the committee. Thank you to the chairs. The stream companies are a diverse set of businesses. We've been focused on long-term stewardship and sustainability of resources, kind of as a mantra of our different companies for a long time. Mostly focused on natural resources we manage, sustainably manage. Large timber holdings on a generational kind of long-term rotational management basis, also coastal wetlands, and have rebuilt and restored tens of thousands of acres of coastal wetlands, mostly in Louisiana and Texas. And then most recently, one of our companies has undertaken to develop a global scale geologic carbon sequestration project in Louisiana, currently in the permit process at the EPA, the Class 6 permit process. So excited to be a part of the committee, appreciate the effort here, and look forward to hopefully having something to contribute.
Thank you. Next, Margot Moss.
Hello, I'm Margot Moss, president of L&M Environmental Response. I got my start on the BP spill before working for LDEQ out of Cerro as an air inspector and doing emergency response. 2016, I started my company, L&M. We do about half compliance across all medias, and that's sampling as well as permitting, Title V, LPDS. The other half of business is emergency response, responding across the country. Very excited to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Roman Hardy. Is Roman on?
I don't believe he is on.
Okay, we will go to Daniel Schantz.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Schantz. I'm a faculty member at Tulane University in the chemical engineering department, where I've been for about 7 years. My lab is looking at materials and processes for both emerging renewable technologies as well as improving or minimizing the environmental footprint of existing technologies. And I'm thrilled to be part of this group and look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you so much, and I apologize, Mr. Schantz. Next is Nathan Mcbride.
Yeah, thanks for having me on this committee here. So my background, I'm the Regulatory Affairs Manager for the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association, and also chair our carbon committee, which we launched earlier this year to discuss carbon issues, and we're really working our interfacing with this task force and this committee through that committee. Our members are committed to environmental stewardship, and as you've seen in the news, pretty much almost every other day or so, we're seeing more and more announcements of folks that are bringing their goals in alignment basically with what Louisiana is wanting to do. So we're looking to carry that forward. My background personally is in the refining industry in Louisiana, so I know a little bit about the industrial side of this. So I look forward to working with this committee and moving forward towards this common goal in Louisiana.
Thank you very much. Next is Zen Saunders.
Good morning, everybody. This is Zen Saunders. I'm the Regulatory Affairs Leader for Dow, and also the Valuing Nature Goal co-leader. In that goal, we're looking to generate $1 billion in value to nature by 2025. We also work with our carbon team on getting to carbon neutral by 2050. And excited to be a part of this committee, and look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Hunter Johnson.
Good morning. I'm Hunter Johnston. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C. with the law firm of Steptoe & Johnson. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to participate in this endeavor. I'm I am originally from Shreveport, Louisiana, and I was educated at Tulane and Georgetown. I represent clients across the spectrum in carbon capture and sequestration. I helped pass the 45Q tax credit in Washington, D.C. Been involved with the Carbon Capture Coalition since its inception and its predecessor organization. And I work very closely with the Lake Charles Methanol Project, which is a large carbon capture project being developed at the Port of Lake Charles in Louisiana, and also other clients in Louisiana interested in carbon capture.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. We'll talk later about Shreveport. Next is Mary Orr.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Lee Orr. I'm Executive Director of Louisiana Environmental Action Network. I've worked with and been a voice for communities for more than 32 years. I'm so excited to be on this wonderful committee. And thank you, Mr. Hardy and Mr. Myers, for heading this up. And thank everyone for allowing us to meet together. I look forward to doing great things together. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And last, I have Scott Anderson.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. Scott Anderson from Austin, Texas. I am the senior director in the energy program for the Environmental Defense Fund. It's probably also worth mentioning in connection to this committee that I'm on the board of visitors for the Bureau of Economic Geology at University of Texas, which you may know is very involved in the sequestration side of CCS. I spent 25 years in the oil and gas business before coming to EDF. I was the executive vice president and general counsel of TIPRO Association, the Texas Independent Producers and Royalty Owners. And then I came to EDF 15 years ago. I was hired to build alliances with enhanced oil recovery producers in order to demonstrate the viability of CCS in the EOR context. My first 5 years at EDF, I worked full-time on CCS. It's the only time in my life I've worked full-time on one thing. And then after the Waxman-Markey bill failed, we EDF took about 7 years off from engagement in CCS. But for the last 3 years, I've been spending 50% of my time on CCS again. With my primary, the primary interest for the energy program at EDF, where CCS is concerned, is making sure that the CO2 stays where we put it. So environmental integrity is my watchword. The other half of my workday is devoted to well integrity issues and produced water management.
Thank you very much. Did I leave anyone out? Is there a name that I did not call that's a member of this committee, Lindsay?
Nope, you got it.
All right, well, if not, I will turn it over to you, Lindsay. But let me say this. Thank you all so much for attending, for being members of this committee. I just think the expertise is absolutely wonderful. I look forward to working with each and every one of you. Lindsay?
Thank you to both of our chairs for leading us in those opening remarks. And I'll just reiterate the remarks of the chairs. Thank you all so much for participating on this committee of the Climate Task Force. And today we'll really jump into some of the context of why we're here, what the governor's executive order lays out, the context of climate change in Louisiana and its relevance to this committee. And then we'll talk through a bit of the broader Climate Task Force overview before we jump into the role specifically in charge for this committee. And then Harry will lead us in an overview of the planning process that we're using to develop these emission reduction strategies. And then we'll jump into a discussion on fundamental objectives. What do we really care about on this committee and what is our effort? And then we'll finish off with some next steps. And as our chairs mentioned, the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities which Harry Vorhoff and I are part of, we will be chairing and staffing the climate task force overall, but we'll also be staffing and helping your chairs in all of these committees to ensure that we have a coordinated effort amongst all of the different groups. And so with that, let's start today by defining some of the problem of why we are here. And so we're brought together, as most of you probably know, by an executive order of the governor that he signed in August of this year. And he created in this executive order the charge and vision for our effort that Louisiana can and will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions with the intent to limit the impacts of climate change on our heritage and on our people, while also adapting and maintaining our position as a world leader. And so even the governor's vision that was set forth in this initial order really confronts head on this, the two fundamental realities that we face in Louisiana, that we are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and must do our part to mitigate those impacts through reducing emissions, but also that we have a leadership position and a leadership role in our industries that we must account for economically as well. So in that executive order that the governor signed in August, he set forth what emission reduction looks like in Louisiana. And as I believe both of our chairs mentioned, you might have seen these three goals adopted by other states and other nations as well. And so this for Louisiana looks like a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions from 2005 levels by 2025. Then there's an interim target of 40 to 50% reduction, again from 2005 level by 2030, and then a final goal of net carbon neutrality by 2050. So having these goals set forth from the beginning of this effort by the governor really gives us clear direction on what we're working towards and what emission reduction needs to look like in Louisiana. And so this effort, the climate task force as a whole, but also this committee more specifically, will focus on the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. And the state has extensive adaptation efforts underway. So that's why we're bringing more focus to the mitigation side. But we also understand the interconnectivity between mitigating emissions and then adapting to climate change. And so this, as I mentioned, sets forth that the work of the task force, the committees, and the advisory groups will all be to set Louisiana on a trajectory to meet these climate emission goals. So everything that we do, all the meetings that we have are intended to bring focus to this goal. And so why have we chosen those specific goals? Simply put, Louisiana needs to reverse the impacts of climate change by reducing our emissions. So human activities are already cause for 1 degree Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels already. And we're set to see another 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming over the coming decades if we don't do anything to reverse those trends. So we need to do our part and reduce our emissions, not only to minimize the climate-related risks that we see through our health, our livelihood, our economies as well, but also to lower the need to adapt to climate change. And so we chose these goals specifically because they've been shown by climate scientists to keep us around that 1.5 degrees of warming and farther away from the 2 degrees. So what does it look like for Louisiana to do our part? Well, let's first look at Louisiana in context of some of the other states in the US, since we've seen other states also adopt these goals. So if you look at this graphic from the World Resources Institute, Louisiana ranks 8th among all states in total emissions. And we're pretty tied closely with New York. And that shows just how high our emissions are per capita in Louisiana. So if we dive a little bit deeper into emissions in the context of GDP and per capita, you can see from this graphic that Louisiana is 4th in emissions per GDP and 5th in emissions per capita. And this really shows the difference of emissions in Louisiana from other states. So there's an acknowledgement and a recognition that our reliance is on industry. The nation depends on the industry that is produced in Louisiana. Also, our economies and our jobs in Louisiana are heavily reliant. But we need to understand that this comes with impacts, and those impacts need to be addressed. So if we look at Louisiana in context of other states, not on the emission side, but on the climate action plan side, you can see that many other states have also set climate goals, and they have created climate action plans, as is what Louisiana is working towards. So 33 other states have released climate action plans. Wisconsin just last Monday released an updated version of their climate action plan. So this shows there's a lot of momentum of other states in what they're doing, but it's important to note that Louisiana is different, and our strategies will look a little bit different than they do for other states. So we can take lessons learned from other states, but need to understand that Louisiana has some uniqueness that needs to be accounted for. So knowing that we have higher emissions, we must also understand that comes with impacts. So though this discussion is focused on emissions and reducing emissions, I also noted that there's interconnectivity between emissions and adaptation. And we're already seeing so many impacts of climate change in Louisiana. So this is not new to us, but it's also not going away. So the National Climate Assessment outlined some key impacts of climate change in the Southeast in their most recent report. And so we can see the experience of increasing heat and worsening air qualities in cities. Infrastructure risk from flooding is worse, and that disproportionately impacts those in lower income and minority neighborhoods. And we're very familiar with the second point on exacerbating flood risks that affect our low-lying communities. And it's a reality that our poorer communities are generally in lower-lying areas and less able to protect themselves and less able to recover. But relevant to this committee, there are also much of our industry is along the coast and near our rivers, and flooding is particularly dangerous for all of your industries as well. And you can see from the graphic on the bottom right that even if we just look at high tide flooding scenarios, our risk is not just linearly increasing, but we're seeing exponential increases in our risk over the coming decades. And the National Climate Assessment also notes that climate change will cause drought and warming winter temperatures and extreme rainfall. We've already experienced these in Louisiana, but we'll continue to see those in more extreme ways. And to the fourth point, these patterns will not only overpower our infrastructure, but impact the seasonality of our agriculture, the distribution of our seafood and fishery industries, the ability to live along our coast, the ability to recover from storms. And we can see particular detriment to those rural regions. And Louisiana is a very rural state, and so those rural risks need to be understood differently than the city risks as well. And I'll note on this graphic that's on the bottom left of the slide, it shows how increasing heat will change the hours that laborers can work outside during the day. And in the Southeast, particularly Louisiana, Texas, and Florida, this will change how we can work outside a lot. And again, relevant to manufacturing, this impacts how your plants can work during the day, and overheating can be a severe risk as well for workers, but also for equipment that is in manufacturing facilities. And so why does this matter in Louisiana? We can see these are interconnected systems. The same risks that we see in rising sea level and increasing intensity of storm is also connected to increasing stress on our urban infrastructure, greater burden on our rural communities, rapid population shifts, also tied with our agricultural productivity and movement from our coastal communities. And this really emphasizes that we can't adequately minimize the impacts of climate change unless we're addressing the root cause of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so we want our adaptation efforts to be as successful as possible. And so that requires us addressing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's some context of why we are here. But noting those extreme challenges that Louisiana faces and will continue to face, it's important that we have a plan of action of what we're going to do for that. And so setting emission reduction goals is our launch pad, but on its own, that's not enough. We need to have a plan of how to reach those goals. So they're certainly attainable goals if we have a path forward to meet them. So in the executive order where we saw the governor lay forth that vision and those emission reduction goals, he also established the Climate Initiatives Task Force, which is tasked to do this very thing, to set Louisiana on a path to meet our goals. And I'll just reiterate here the vision that was set forth for Louisiana to reduce our emissions, avoid the worst impacts of climate change, improve welfare of our residents, and maintain our position as a leader in industry. And doing that through the emission reduction goals. This is our task force, looking at the overall Climate Initiatives Task Force. It's a 23-member body composed of different state agencies, nonprofit and environmental groups, as well as industry and local government, community groups, and other representatives as well. And so this is the main steering body for the climate initiative. And as I mentioned, this is chaired by the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. And when we brought together such a broad group of stakeholders in that first meeting, we set forth these values for the task force of respect, integrity, transparency, science-based decision-making, and consensus-driven decisions. And the task force held its first meeting in the beginning of November. And after that is when we've launched all of the committees. And as you saw on the last slide, we are bringing together quite a broad group of members. And it's important that we have values that guide the discussions that we have and the decisions that we'll make. And so first, we must root our discussion in respect for the voice of others and hold conversations with integrity, knowing that it's imperative in this effort to bring together such a broad group of members. And each of you are very critical to this effort, and your perspective is necessary. But that requires us to understand voices that we might not be as familiar with. To the third point, we'll also maintain transparency in our effort through clearly voicing our objectives and our perspectives in a manner that includes other committee members, but also includes and encourages the involvement of public as well, because these are all public meetings and we really value public input and want the public to be aware of what our goals are and convey that in a transparent manner. And then we'll also move through this process to ensure we're making decisions based off of the most accurate and up-to-date science. And that the decisions that are made, particularly at the task force level, are driven by consensus of our members. But we know that this 23-member task force cannot solely be the ones to help us meet our emission reduction targets. So for that reason, we've created many subgroups under the task force. So you can note on this graphic that we've created 4 advisory groups in the green bubbles and then 6 sector-based committees in the blue bubbles. And these advisory groups, going back to those, we've created these 4 groups because we believe we need these 4 subject matter expertise throughout all conversations in the effort. So that includes having the most updated and accurate science, that we're making decisions based off of evidence and facts of what is best in science. Also that we are finding opportunities to increase equity and reduce inequities through the emission reduction strategies that we move forward. Third, that we create financially feasible solutions that create new economic opportunities. And lastly, that we have legally and also policy sound principles that we can implement and that will be successful moving forward. And as I mentioned, these 6 emission sector committees are focused on the major emission sectors in Louisiana. So you can note on here manufacturing and industry, but we also have power production, oil and gas, transportation, land use, buildings and housing, and agriculture, forestry, conservation, and waste. If we dive into a little more of the roles, we talked about this briefly on the last slide, but the role of committees will be to scope emission sources and sinks within their sector and also develop and evaluate emission reduction strategies relevant to their sector. So that's where this group will fit in on the manufacturing and industry side, is on scoping what is in and out of this sector and also developing and evaluating emission reduction strategies here. Committees will interact with advisory groups, those 4 advisory groups, to provide subject matter expertise on the emission reduction strategies. And the advisory groups will also advise the task force and the committees upon request. And then the task force, as I mentioned, is our overall steering committee. It's our overall steering body for the effort. And they will be in charge of developing and approving the interim and final climate reports. And also to mention, on this slide, I've outlined the role of the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, but we are also partnering with the Water Institute of the Gulf to provide expertise and help us through the planning process and developing the decision-making process of how to create these reports. And with that, I'll outline a few deliverables that this group and the broader task force will be working towards. In the governor's executive order, he required an interim report and a final report be produced by the task force. And so this interim report will focus more on the context of this effort, why we're here, what does climate change mean in Louisiana, and also outlining the objectives and the charge for all of the subgroups and our work plan for the coming year. And the final report, the one that is due in February of 2022, will focus on the emission reduction strategies and really lay forth what that plan is to set Louisiana on a path to meet those emission reduction goals. And then sandwiched in the middle there, we're working on an update to the state greenhouse gas inventory. Our most recent inventory was done in 2010 with 2005 data. So that's great for setting a baseline of the effort. As I mentioned, we're reducing from a 2005 baseline, but we need to understand where Louisiana stands now. What do our emissions look like now? So we, in concert with other state agencies, are commissioning an update to this inventory. And the science advisory group of this effort will be helping to inform that update as we move forward. And that will be done through the LSU Center for Energy Studies. To look at this timeline a little bit more for our deliverables, I won't dive into the details of every step along the way, but I want to show you that even though this is a short timeline, we do have a path and a process of how we can meet these goals over the next year and a half or 14 months. So there's a few things to note on this slide. You can see highlighted in blue are the deliverables that we just talked through. So the interim report, the greenhouse gas inventory update, and the final strategy. But I also wanted to bring light to a few other things noted on the timeline. Once we get into the winter of 2021, so next year, there will be a call for a public solicitation of emission reduction proposals where we really encourage members of the public, members of our committees, the advisory groups, and the task force as well to submit proposals on how to reduce emissions in each of these sectors. So these committees will spend much of the spring reviewing and revising and evaluating these publicly proposed ideas. So we can then determine what's the best set of strategies for Louisiana to meet our emission reduction goals. So it's important that now the committees and advisory groups have clear charges and objectives and scopes so that when we enter the public process in this new year, that we have very defined committees and very defined roles. And I'll highlight one more thing on here. In the fall of 2021, we'll be doing a trade-off analysis of all of the different emission reduction strategies. And this will ensure that we're not creating separate strategies in each committee, but that the strategies are interconnected across committees. We know that it's hard to draw lines with some of these committees. There's a lot of interconnectivity in our emissions. And so understanding that, we wanted to have an analysis after we've done the review of proposals so that we can better understand the trade-offs and create complementary and effective emission reduction proposals. But I'll dive a little bit deeper into the interim report since that is coming up on us quickly. This, as I had mentioned, is due in February 1st of 2021. So this report, due in just a month and a half, will really focus on the context of climate change and the problem that we're defining here. It will also focus on the mission and vision, the process, and the work plan for the overall effort. And I highlighted in that third section the role of the committees and advisory groups, because that's what you guys in manufacturing and industry will help inform for us. So this will be an overview of the emissions sector, the objectives of this group, how we intend to reach those objectives, and also identifying opportunities and challenges and further defining the scope of the committee. We really want to have that solidified in the interim report. And there is no hiding that this is a quick turnaround from having our first meeting in December to producing this in February. And that does require us to work quickly and will require investment from all of our members across the board to meet these goals. So narrowing into what that means for this committee, I'll first note that the charge for advisory groups is different from the committees. So before we dive into the committee, I think it's important to note what the other groups will be doing while you guys are tackling your charge. So advisory groups will review emission reduction strategies and provide assistance to the task force to ensure there are comprehensive strategies produced. And so the role of committees is developing and evaluating those emission reduction proposals. So you can see that the committees will work very closely with the advisory groups in developing and evaluating and refining those proposals. But if we dive into what that looks like specifically for manufacturing and industry, this is a draft charge of what we have developed, but we would also like to note we would also like all of you to note if we're missing anything in this. And so the charge that we've put forth is for the Manufacturing and Industry Committee to examine opportunities to reduce emissions within the manufacturing and industrial sectors, including petrochemical manufacturing, petroleum refining, and other operations within the state. This committee will consider opportunities to deploy cleaner sources of energy to fuel operations, enhance efficiencies, reduce unintentional releases, capture and sequester or reuse emissions, offset emissions, and other measures that reduce net emissions from combustion and non-combustion manufacturing and industrial activities. So I know that's a hefty charge, but would like to offer that up for consideration and any additions by the chairs and members of this group. And with that, I'll take any questions that you all have or any input on the charge that was set forth. Does anyone have questions on the overview of the task force, more specifically on manufacturing?
I've got one. So this particular slide doesn't refer to greenhouse gas emissions, but rather to just emissions generally. And I'm wondering whether non-greenhouse gas emissions are germane to this project.
We envision that they would be germane to this discussion, particular focus to the greenhouse gas emissions, but also the non-GHG emissions as well. Any other questions or additions to make to this charge?
Just to follow up on that question, I guess what's the, I guess in essence of time, I would think it would be beneficial to look at, to focus on the greenhouse gas, but that's my initial thought. But I was just wondering what's the reason for looking into the other emissions as well?
this is Harry. I think I think you're right that the main goal, the ultimate objective, is to focus on greenhouse gas emissions, and we'll be getting into a discussion about fundamental objectives, where what are other important aspects to consider as we're evaluating the different strategies. And so I think including greenhouse gas emissions in the charge is fine, and then we can clarify other fundamental objectives along the way, kind of in the immediate discussion after this, if that is kind of the interest of this group.
Do we have any more questions for Lindsay or Harry? All right, yes, we'll move forward. Thank you very much, Lindsay. That was very informative. Actually, our next topic is the discussion of our committee charge, and we will open that topic up for all of our members who would like to discuss. Give everybody a minute or so to reread.
As so everybody's, go ahead.
I guess I'll say something since we're not all talking at once. So my main interest is in CCS, and in particular the environmental integrity of sequestration projects, making sure the CO2 stays put. So in terms of the sequestration side of CCS, I think there's two top level issues. One is making sure that the regulatory agency or agencies have got sufficient capacity to do a good job of overseeing this activity. So that boils down to budget, staff, and training. The other key issue that I see for the environmental integrity of CCS is making sure that the people who are operating the sequestration projects are responsible for mistakes and poor performance. So that basically means that, in my opinion, the state should maintain sufficient degree of liability risk for the managers and operators of these facilities, or else you'll risk having facilities that leak. And then my other comment, since we've already talked about the non-greenhouse gas emissions, is just to point out that methane is also a very significant greenhouse gas. As far as I know, that's probably more of a topic for the oil and gas sector committee and maybe some other committees than it is for this one, but I thought I'd go ahead and mention methane because it is very important.
Thank you for those comments. And kind of dovetailing on that, as we were putting to this charge together, we included petroleum refining, and to your comment, Mr. Anderson, about kind of the overlap or kind of defining the scope is we wanted to get everyone's thoughts on whether refining should be fits better with manufacturing and industry with this group we do, or with the mining, oil and gas group, which will certainly the mining, oil and gas committee will cover exploration, production, and transportation, and so we were not sure which who should cover it, just as some traffic control here, but open that up to any thoughts.
Yeah, this is Nathan Mcbride with Lamoga. My opinion would be to keep petroleum refining under the under this industry category, just because it's analogous to petrochemical manufacturing, just from a process perspective. There are some differences between, the constituents and chemicals coming into the refinery are the same as what you'd see in the oil and gas side of the E&P and the pipelines, but the actual chemical processes themselves and the products that are made through those processes would be more closely aligned with the petrochemical manufacturing space.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The upstream oil and gas industry and the downstream oil industry are totally different beasts, and yeah, I would definitely agree that refining has more in common with chemical and industrial processes than it does oil and gas production.
Thanks for that. And what about and anybody else can comment as well, but I'd also throw out LNG facilities.
That was another question I had, just for clarification. I know you have on here other operations within the state, and I was wondering if that would include other plants such as LNG. I'm thinking some other ones like a methanol type plant. That's not your traditional petrochemical or refining operation. However, it is a manufacturing operation, and it is potentially a source for CO2. And sequestration project. So that was actually my next question. And my opinion would be to advocate for at least LNG being included in this industry committee.
Harry, this is Hunter. Increasingly competitiveness of LNG is going to depend on the carbon intensity opportunities with respect to it, not just upstream, but actually downstream. So if you do have carbon capture in connection with CO2 streams that are, high priority and sort of low level opportunities, that could actually help Louisiana become better competitive in a world market where consumers, like in the European Union, are concerned about carbon intensity. So I would argue, for the other reasons that were already covered, the similarities, but also from a competitiveness standpoint, that it be included.
Okay, great. And perhaps we can clarify, just chemical and petrochemical, or something along those lines. I don't know if you need to break out petrochemical specifically, or if it's encompassed under chemical to cover methanol. And
I think you could just maybe add a clarifier to the and other operations. Maybe say that other. Maybe just other manufacturing operations within the state. Maybe that would be broad enough to capture it.
Sure. I think that makes sense. And the main, goal is to just make sure everybody's clear, right? We're, wordsmithing this for that purpose. And so as long as everybody's just clear on sort of who's covering what, we satisfy our goal.
Do we have anybody else? Anybody else who wants to offer any suggestions on our charge?
Yeah, I'll just add, echoing everyone else's thoughts on the term reducing emissions there and narrowing it to carbon dioxide equivalents, just because I think the strategy for reducing and offsetting those emissions would be different than other emissions. So I do think that was a very important point raised. The other thing I'll add is that I think it would be good to consider adding that this committee should evaluate policy or regulatory impacts overall and its impact to the industry. Maybe not just focusing on reducing emissions, but whatever changes come out of maybe the committee or other committees or the task force in general, understanding how that impacts the industry.
Certainly, I think that's a very important point, and something that is going to be identified and discussed kind of as we go through this process, and certainly understanding the consequences of proposed strategies is an important part of the process.
Okay, thank you, Zen. Do we have anybody else?
Yeah, just one question. Where would landfill gas emissions, would that be covered by this? Because obviously landfill gas emissions across the country is a major source of GHG and CO2e.
So there is an Ag, Forestry, Conservation, and Waste Management Committee. And our thinking is that waste management would, landfills would be covered under that group. But Lindsay also is coordinating on that committee. So I don't know if that was a question that came up with that group.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they'll be handling the waste side. Great question, though.
Okay, thank you, Hunter. Anyone else? Okay, so hearing none, we'll move on to our next topic, which will be our structured decision-making process, and we'll turn it back over to Harry.
All right, thank you. I'm going to pull up the screen. All right, and now that Lindsay has provided kind of the overview of the task force and getting into the problem, wanted to spend some time and get everybody a little bit up to speed on the process. And working with our partner, the Water and Security Gulf, we are structuring this using a structured decision-making process, or SDM. And the benefits or objectives of SDM is to analyze decisions, to identify solutions that achieve the desired outcomes in an explicit and transparent manner. And explicit is critical as we try and put everything on the table in terms of our fundamental objectives and what our goals are, defining the issue on the front end. And then transparent, by making it explicit, we are increasing transparency and ensuring that voices are heard throughout this process. It also, and a lot of that is based on clearly articulating the fundamental objectives, and we'll get into a discussion of that in just a moment. But it's a process that is iterative, excuse me, and integrates science and policy. And so this is the structured decision-making framework. As I mentioned, it is iterative, and so we will continue to improve this process. And as Lindsay went over, we defined the problem, and the governor in his executive order defined the problem, and what are the, and also define the ultimate fundamental objective of this task force is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to hit the targets identified in his executive order. The third step is, and so we're going to have a discussion of the fundamental objectives that this committee thinks that the task force should consider and adopt and incorporate as its own in just a minute. But the rest of the framework, so then this committee will really be, after fundamental objectives are identified, this committee in particular, all the committees will be take that first cut at identifying solutions. And so as Lindsay mentioned, we'll have a public solicitation of solutions. And so the committee, at the committee level, you'll be kind of breaking those submissions into buckets and trying to make sense of it and to review it in an orderly way. That review and ultimate recommendations will go up to the advisory groups for an independent review to make sure, to see what the consequences and potential consequences of any solution could be, particularly from a vetting from the perspective of science, finance, equity, and law. And then after the advisory groups provide their input and their evaluation, they'll offer it back down to the committees to consider for potential modification, and then ultimately the committee's recommendations will go up to the task force. The advisory group analyses will also go up to the task force, and so ultimately it's the task force that is charged with evaluating those trade-offs, evaluating those consequences, and ultimately making the decision on which actions to take. And so as Lindsay went over, and as the governor defined in his executive order, we are really, the task is to proactively work to reduce emissions. And as you see here, and there are many reasons, that climate change is an existential threat for Louisiana, and we need to really work to avoid the worst impacts. Lindsay also mentioned the 2005 greenhouse gas emissions inventory. As you can see, the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion back in 2005 were 84% of the state's total emissions. And as you can see on the right, nearly 50% were from the industrial sector. So certainly this committee has a lot of work to do and a lot of, and so look forward to working with all of you on that. It's not, combustion is not the sole source of emissions. And as you see in that blue box, about 6% or nearly 6% in 2005 were from industrial processes which are not combustion. And as you can see here, there are many sources of the non-combustion emissions. And so now moving into fundamental objectives, and we really want to hear from all of you about what the task force should consider as it evaluates emissions reduction solutions. What do we care about? You could also think of it, there are many ways to get up the mountain. And so, how you go, what trail you choose is going to be guided based on those fundamental objectives. And so you see so here are some examples. You see on the left, the ultimate fundamental objective of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing and industry sectors. But there are, you could also put forward maximizing opportunities to increase number and quality of jobs for Louisiana, particularly in those neighboring communities to manufacturing and industrial sites, or avoiding or minimizing impacts on fence line communities. So those are examples of fundamental objectives. And so we wanted to open it up to all of you, and we'll start with our chairs. So Chairman Myers, you work for DEQ, and on behalf of DEQ, what do you think we should care about, or this task force should really care about, in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
As far as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as you know, LDEQ's mission is to protect the environment and do so and promote and protect health and safety and welfare while considering sound policies. So as far as our objective, I think that we can do that by all working together to come up with a plan for us to limit these greenhouse gas emissions and do so really come up with a plan that everybody can work with.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'll be trying to capture what we're discussing here kind of as we go along. And Chairman Hardy, what do you think should be the fundamental objectives of the task force? Chairman Hardy, you are on mute.
I apologize. Technological challenge a little bit this morning. I think we should look at policies, regulation statutes to, first of all, make sure that there aren't impediments that get us where we want to go. I think if we can put into place policies that encourage those reductions, maybe give some benefit to those that do those early on, because one of the things we know is that the earlier reductions are easier to meet than later down the road. So again, I look very strongly toward policies, regulation statutes, and look at how we can balance those. I mean, we already have a requirement to do that under Article 9, Section 1 of the state constitution in terms of the public trust doctrine, in terms of balancing environmental costs and environmental benefits. And we do that in the federal system through NEPA and the EIS process. But what I'd like to know, if we can determine what are incentives that can make us go beyond those and at the same time protect the interests of industry, creation of jobs, and our economic climate here in Louisiana. I don't want to go on too long, but I think that's the opportunity, maybe a challenge, but also the opportunity of this committee. And I might add, with a view toward, as you talked about earlier, transparency and input, public outreach. So we can also identify not only communicating with our communities, their impact, but also provide a mechanism for their input.
Thank you. And let me know if I'm not capturing it as I go. I'm trying to do my best here, but at this point, I'd really open it up to the rest of the committee members for their input. No, Mr. Johnston. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Ms. Orr.
Okay. Hey, thank you. I have some questions here, and Mr. Myers and Mr. Hardy and other committee members. Coordinating individual company climate policies. I'm gonna write these down. Many have these with emission reduction targets and are achievements. Is everyone following those in Louisiana? Do we know? Mr. Myers?
I am not sure. I don't know.
Ms. Orr, I know that a lot of the companies have their climate change targets like listed on their websites. They have their climate target reports for a lot of the major companies. So I mean, that stuff is available publicly. I think they yearly kind of give updates to their stakeholders as to where they are when it comes to meeting their emissions targets.
Yes, ma'am, I understand. I just wondered if everyone was doing that. There are some very good companies that are doing that, but I didn't know if everyone was involved in that. So that was just a question.
Okay.
Okay. And the Louisiana permit process needs to institute a comprehensive greenhouse gas component. Each facility needs to address the greenhouse gas and the LDEQ permit processing. Mr. Myers, you could probably address this better than others, maybe, when applying for either new construction, renewals of modifications, or, et cetera. And every opportunity must be utilized to reduce this reduction goal, we feel, on behalf of the communities, and you all too.
Thank you, Ms. Orr. Let me know if I'm capturing this correctly.
Okay. Can I jump in? I just wanted to, I guess as we're throwing out ideas, LCA has recently started up a climate change work group, climate change sustainability work group, and we've kind of put together some policy principles, and one of the ones, and we have several, we'll talk about that as we go on with this call, but one of the ones that we are really strongly advocating is developing low and lower carbon energy choices through development of innovative products and technology. Yeah, so we think that low and lower carbon choices really should be part of the solution to reduce greenhouse gases, but we have to do that without impairing competitiveness, which is what Tim said earlier, making sure that we have sustained economic growth while we're also trying to meet our climate change, our climate reduction goals, our emission reduction goals.
Thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it. I have more, but I'm gonna be quiet till everybody else speaks.
I'd like to jump in just as a general strategy. Mr. Hardy had mentioned the low-hanging fruit, and there's some tactics and incentives that are much, much easier to obtain than the longer-term goals. And I would just like to suggest, I'm not sure if the interim report would be a good location for those, but if we can kind of quickly identify some of those low-hanging fruit and get incentives and quickly implement them, that might help just get the ball rolling while we try to work out some of the more complex solutions.
That's a great point. And I think with the interim report due in about 6 weeks, it's a tall order. I think we're going to try and focus on just the process and making sure everybody understands, feels comfortable with the process and we can define objectives, but definitely agree. I mean, the reason for having the interim report, which was the idea kind of before we had the most active hurricane season on record, which kind of delayed our effort in launching, was just that, to kind of identify some low-hanging fruit. I think it's important, and we can do that kind of as those solutions, as the committees start to identify solutions in the new year. And we don't have to necessarily wait on a final report if there are things that can be identified and kind of agreed upon kind of on the front end. So I think that's something to keep in mind as we think through how are we going to, and how is this committee going to begin to evaluate the various proposals, because there are going to be short, medium, long-term proposals that are identified, and sort of thinking through how we want to approach it is important. And I certainly encourage, I'm glad Ms. Moss, you're thinking about it now, and I encourage everybody to start thinking about how we are going to go through and sort of prioritize.
Yeah, I know that specifically, like with LDAR, there's a lot of voluntary compliance that companies are already undertaking, and to somehow memorialize that into our strategy might be helpful to just kick it off.
I think building on what Margot just said, recognizing that the transition from from where we are now to low carbon energy choices takes time and takes a little patience, so that as we're taking time to kind of figure out what the strategy is and then implement that strategy is going to take time as well. So I think memorializing that, so folks don't think that these companies and whoever else is implicated here can just automatically, implement these things, just off the bat, but that this stuff does take time. So I think that that should be recognized somewhere, that this is going to be a process and that it won't happen instantaneously.
Mr. Johnston, do you have one that were you trying to raise your hand?
Yeah. Thank you, Harry. Just a couple of points. One is on the incentives front. I think it'd be important to consider that, most actual ambition right now with respect to decarbonization is focused on the federal credits, the federal incentives that are in place, both from a tax incentive 45Q and also from a general funding approach. So figuring out how to best take advantage of those policies for a state which is so CO2 intensive as Louisiana, and sort of evaluating what the different costs of capture are, because there's a wide variety of costs of capture, which is an impediment to decarbonization. So trying to figure that out, I think, is important. So it's sort of from an incentive standpoint, focusing in on what's available today. And then I would also just mention that from a state perspective, of course, the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard is a major driver of activity, even in Louisiana, to the extent that Louisiana businesses can help manufacture product that would actually enter into the California market. Just evaluating whether Louisiana would like to go down a path of evaluating, a similar policy or that kind of thing is also, I think, an important consideration if we're looking at recommendations on policy. And then finally, I would just mention as an incentive on the demand side of things, the way that the economy is the way that on the demand side, there's a greater recognition of need for blue products, which are products that could be manufactured in Louisiana that are decarbonized in some fashion by carbon capture, and creating incentives around blue products and also green products, which are more from a renewable pathway, is going to be an important consideration on the incentive side. I know that was a lot, so sorry about that.
Yes, so I have something to add to one of Hunter's things, although I don't think it needs to be written down, but just an additional comment on the California LCFS, which, as he said, is available to projects in Louisiana, and it's a much larger tax credit than 45Q. There are some problems with the California LCFS from a developer perspective, and work is being begun out there to ease some of these problems. But one of the issues that's going to be in play is for California to give comity or endorsement to certain decisions being made by the regulators in other states. So just to give one quick example, one of the requirements of LCFS is that you have to have a monitoring system in effect to enable you to assess and avoid the risk of earthquakes over 2.7 magnitude. Conceivably, that or other decisions like that could be actually made by the home state and recognized by California if California thought the state's approach to that or other issues was sufficient.
Thank you for that, making that point. Mr. Johnson, have you tried to unmute yourself? Do you have any fundamental objectives that you'd like to offer? Not to put you on the spot. If you want to think it over a little bit more, that's fine.
I'm sorry, you're asking me if to help you edit the document that you're typing in real time.
I was actually, if you have any thoughts, I was actually talking to Mr. Morris, Johnson, from Johnston to Johnson.
Sorry about that.
No, just a couple comments, most of which we've touched on, but I think identifying impediments to decarbonized production are obviously critical, both from a permitting perspective for CCS projects, but also access to pipelines to get there, I think are another potential impediment that we need to address. And also on the manufacturing side, access to affordable renewable power as we move from blue to green, both short-term and long-term is obviously critical for manufacturing to be successful.
That's great. I think this group is certainly going to need to tease out, what can easily be electrified, what cannot be electrified, and and for those things that can't be, what are greener or bluer sources. So certainly.
I just want to add something else too. Going to one of our overall goals of transparency, I think that having metrics is clearly important, but we also need to have some sort of verification in place or some sort of transparent validation of those metrics in order to gain trust from the state, to show that not only are we reaching those goals, but we're confident in it. I think that just will go across all of these different objectives as we go forward.
Definitely. And yeah, and I think we're going to have some of that at least, and the goal of setting up these advisory groups with very specialized expertise should help in terms of the increasing transparency and trust in terms of the evaluations that the committees are doing. They'll get a second look, second, third, fourth look from the advisory groups, and then ultimately the task force. But that's a good point.
I'll just add to one of the points that you already have written there, where you discuss states and federal level incentives and frameworks. I'll just also add, consideration for international frameworks as well, or global frameworks, however you want to put it. I could see a lot of opportunity with potentially working outside of even the country on these issues.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. This is a worldwide effort.
I would offer a friendly amendment to the first bullet. The way I think about safety, welfare, and health is that it would already include the environment, but it might be good to make that explicit and say promote safety, welfare, health, and environmental protection.
Very good.
Also, Harry, environmental protection, while considering sound policies, of course.
Say that one more time. Sorry, I missed it.
While considering sound policies.
Sound policy?
Right, and our statutory mandates, right. So,
okay. And Mr. Stream, you have your hand raised?
Sure. I could just keep my mouth shut because these points have really been made, but I also hate to be the guy that doesn't at least try to reinforce someone else's good points as an initial contribution. I think there's a pattern in some of the comments that have been made that really recognize the fact that although Louisiana does generate greenhouse gas emissions and a not insignificant amount, we're a percentage of U.S. emissions. U.S. emissions, I think, are last I heard about 15% of global. So you've got 85% of the rest of the world that's growing, and Louisiana in particular, and Louisiana industry and manufacturing, and there are others on this call that can speak to this better than I can because I don't represent Louisiana industry and manufacturing, but I'm vividly aware of the fact that that industry competes on a global basis, and if we don't solve the needs of our markets here in the United States, then others will elsewhere. And we had some interesting moments earlier this year where we didn't really control our own destiny in terms of access to critical items and so forth, based on manufacturing and supply chain problems, because ultimately those industries have been, motivated to move internationally. So how we do all this and without killing off really our own manufacturing base, these jobs, this economic opportunity, and really in the process, potentially issues of national security, I think is critically important. And to that, a couple of points I would highlight would be, that folks have identified the fact that we need to identify the impediments and ensure that, you know, in the process of trying to create these improvements, that we actually allow improvements to occur, because I think that there are a lot of good actors trying to lean in and make this happen. And sometimes we are the, maybe the perfect's the enemy of the good, or whatever, however we might want to put it. So I do appreciate that being pointed out. And then especially wanted to point out something that I'd hate to sort of see it get buried. I think Hunter made this point. It's very good. Are there ways for us to participate in, you know, increasing attention to the demand side of the equation? Because I think that's ultimately where a lot of impact is going to be made. It's how demand side influences. And the point was made about, you know, how do we speak up politically to ensure that national and international policy that affects us, and potentially even, you know, us in a way that's disproportionate based on our fragile ecosystem. You know, how do we speak up to try to influence those policies? But really wanted to highlight that that demand side point, and see if we can generate policy that makes an impact there. So.
Thank you. Yeah, great points. And sorry, the trash pickup is going by right outside the house, so there's a little background noise.
Anytime you get on a call, there's going to be a guy with a leaf blower or a you know, a weed eater or something. Not to mention a trash truck.
But I do want to pull out, because I think some of your comments have already been captured. But your comment about, you know, that this Louisiana's emissions play, you know, just a portion of the global problem, but and the need to, was I hearing kind of the need to, or potentially position ourselves to export that technology, or you know, that know-how, you know, as an economic driver?
That's generous of you. You did take it on to you know, a good point there, which I can't take credit for. I think I failed to make it there, but that is talked about quite a bit. And I agree that that's absolutely valid. And that's not entirely in technology either. This may not be as much on this committee as much as some others. But, you know, environmental process and environmental innovation, I was really encouraged by the governor's creation of this task force as maybe a means to really drive innovation, and not just sort of, you know, and I don't hear it being kind of thought of in this way as just sort of punitive or adding, you know, cost or making us less competitive, but really trying to drive innovation.
Very good point.
Gary, just to expand on Gray's point, thank you, Gray, for those are tremendous points. On the demand side, just to be specific with respect to opportunities of like which blue sectors would be important for Louisiana. Louisiana has an opportunity for, I mean, there's representatives even on this commission for blue ammonia, blue LNG, blue steel, where if we if we produce those products in Louisiana, then exporting those products is a worldwide market for all those products, blue methanol. Then what by default, what will happen is Louisiana will be the leader of lowest carbon intensity products in the country, because we're already a leader with respect to manufacturer of those gray products. So if there's a pathway to actually produce the blue products, it'll put us as a global leader in the manufacture of those products. And that's really where I was going with sort of the broad demand side. I think that's what Gray was referring to as well.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Any other thoughts? I know, Ms. Orr, you said you have a few more. So I don't want to, while other folks are thinking of additional.
But no, I think this is great. I love this discussion, and we're well aware that this cannot happen overnight. I really appreciate Ms. Moss's, I believe, point where everything is transparent, which it is so far. And we want to reassure the communities that I represent and the folks, that these are real and tangible reductions. But we also understand this can't be done overnight. So it's a great discussion. I'm really enjoying listening to everyone. So that was it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to ask one thing, clarifying about increased jobs, and I really don't have a lot to add because a lot of what I had written down to discuss has already been covered very thoroughly. So especially regarding incentives and things like that. But around the jobs piece, I just wanted to make sure, like, obviously the goal, and that's really our primary, goal with interfacing with this group, is to grow industry, grow our economy as a state as we're working to bring about environmental quality. But I wanted to make sure, and maybe we're looking at this, and maybe it's already covered on some of these other points, but looking at a gross increase in jobs, but at the same time, I don't want to be taking from existing jobs and impacting employees negatively while we're creating jobs in this other space here. I want to make sure that we're protecting that base that we have and growing from there. Does that make sense?
Does that capture it? And protecting existing jobs?
Yes, I think you're probably talking transitioning from one type of job to another.
Yeah, so, I get the transition, but I guess what my concern is, if we come out with, and I don't think anything has necessarily been said up until this point, and I'm not saying that it will, but I just want to make sure that we're not looking at policy that will, and I guess we've talked about it already, but we're not doing policy or regulating by flipping a switch, which is going to basically instantaneously end these jobs and create other ones here. It needs to be a well thought out, well planned transition. Because this is people's livelihoods that are at stake here, and if we make too big of movements too fast, it could have detrimental impacts to certain employees.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
All right. Well, this was, I think, very productive. I appreciate it. And just to clarify, so at the upcoming, there will be another task force meeting, the second task force meeting next Monday, it looks like. And all of the committees and advisory groups will be reporting out on their discussion of their mission and the fundamental objectives discussion that they had in the and this will be more of a status update. We'll give everybody an opportunity to think through any additional fundamental objectives until tomorrow night for consideration for next Monday. But this is, again, an iterative process. So if they don't make it into that committee report for next Monday, it doesn't mean that the conversation is closed. I think from what I hear with the SDM structured decision-making process, you often will come across a fundamental objective that wasn't identified earlier in the process, but is identified as something that is really important that everybody's kind of thinking about in the back of their head. So just to kind of put everybody at ease that keep thinking about it, and we'll continue to refine as we go along. And so, again, let me back out into the presentation. And so really, I think it's time to move into a discussion of next steps. As I started to get into, we'll have our next task force meeting next week. We'll have committee advisory group report outs. And then in January, the committees and advisory groups will come back for another discussion of scoping and challenges for developing solutions and opportunities. And we can begin to broach the subject that Margot raised of Ms. Moss about looking at the short term versus midterm and long term, and how we want to approach discussion of those solutions. And then in January, probably the second half of January, the task force again will meet to approve the interim report and start talking through draft rubrics and look ahead to the 2021 timeline. And so between now and then, the GOCA staff and the Water Institute of the Gulf will be compiling and synthesizing draft fundamental objectives that were identified today and to put before the task force for their consideration. So if you have any additional ones kind of for the near term or want to put a finer point on any comments made, if you could send those to climate@la.gov by tomorrow. Also, please start just to think about and identify and share resources. We'll circulate a Google Drive link so we can start pooling resources to inform this conversation and refine the scope and identify types of emissions and emissions reduction strategies for this committee. Same with identifying knowledge gaps. So we're trying to pull together as much information as possible, and we'll help synthesize that information so it's digestible and can be discussed by this committee. And for the public's benefit, we have a website, which is shown here, where we post our notices and we'll provide updates. You can also get updates by signing up via the portal at the website and submit public comments at climate@la.gov. And so we will now take, if it's all right with the chairs, let's call it a 5-minute break, just so to give people the time to type out their comments and submit it to climate@la.gov. We want to make sure that everyone who's watching and wishes to submit a comment has the ability to do so. As a reminder, in the subject line of your email, you should include a reference to the Manufacturing and Industry Committee, so we know that your comment is in reference to this committee meeting and the agenda item if it is specific to an agenda item. If it's not, then you don't need to include any reference to an agenda item. And in the body of the email, you should include your name and address. And so we'll take a slight break and come back at, by my watch, 11:49. That works for everybody.
It does.
Very good.
Members, I will begin reading our public comments into the record as they are received in order that they've been received. We have about 7 so far, so we might run a few minutes over our noon timeline. I'll start first with a public comment from Angel Bradford from the Sierra Club Delta Chapter Executive Committee. And her comment reads, "Hello, I am just writing to ask that this committee, perhaps the most important committee of the task force, as carbon reduction emissions in Louisiana are truly beholden to the manufacturing and industry part of our economy, takes your job seriously. Please create what seems like pie in the sky dream goals and metrics, and refrain from staying within the box of what appears to be politically savvy or astute. Science supports robust policy proposals and recommendations that are being implemented across this country and world. Follow those robust steps, as truly stopping climate change will require bold action and radical change within less than a decade. Sincerely, Angel Bradford." Our next comment comes from Scott Eustace of Healthy Gulf, and his public comment reads, "As industrial emissions are the leading cause of the climate crisis and wetland loss into 2067, and Shell Convent demonstrates that failing to lower emissions and become more efficient will lead to capital discipline actions within Louisiana, which often hosts the least efficient factories in companies' portfolios. Manufacturing and industry in Louisiana must take a new path or be left abandoned, like the Shell Convent refinery. Many thousands of jobs were promised to Louisianans during the fracking boom after 2013, but most or all of these jobs went to people from out of state for the benefit of companies out of the state. People employed by companies in the fracking boom often then left the state, mostly to Texas. Despite the promise of manufacturing in Louisiana, the state has lost jobs, people, and health to the boom. Louisiana economic development must undertake sociological and environmental justice analysis of the sites LED advertises as pre-certified for industrial development, thus radically increasing industrial emissions, according to the latest EPA best practices, last updated in 2016 and implemented by the Corps in 2017. And Scott provides attachments that I will also provide for all of you members. Scott continues by saying, "The Manufacturing and Industrial Committee should recommend LED take this sociological analysis. The committee must recognize sociology as a scientific discipline which sets legal precedent and includes sociological data in their analysis and any recommendations, according to the Bullard and Wright et al. Methods published in Environmental Law." And he provides another link. "Each new proposal pre-certified by LED often seeks to increase Louisiana's carbon footprint by the equivalent of a small nation. Formosa Plastics and other companies have identified LED as one source of environmental racism in their site selection process. These new emission sites are slated to be the origin of the highest carbon emissions per capita in the US and perhaps the world. These emissions from these sites will far exceed the emission saving or mitigation from an electric Louisiana fleet or industrial carbon sequestration. I will highlight as one example of how issues are interrelated the Formosa Plastics proposed in St. James Parish. The emissions from the Formosa Plastic proposal alone, 13 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year, will exceed the emissions of every automobile in the state of Louisiana by a couple times. LDEQ must deny that permit until the impacts to health, small businesses, and our coastal wetlands via aggregated sea level rise have been assessed. And the committee should recommend that carbon-intensive applicants conduct these scientific reviews, sociological and health impacts, and local block group economic impacts before air permits are approved. The committee should recommend that these permits be put on hold until such studies are conducted. The committee should also recommend that LDEQ command these new facilities, all LNG export, plastic manufacturing, methanol manufacturing, and oil export proposals, review these effects in a programmatic or area-wide environmental impact statement. This would be the fastest and cheapest way to ensure that any proper plan to ensure industrial efficiency is involved in the state's decision on climate. These decisions are being made as we speak and will have to be made by 2023. Often these climate emitted or carbon sequestration sites are in Native American villages or African American towns and will affect Black and Indigenous Louisianans disproportionately with cancer risk to young and old, including unborn children. These Block groups are suffering the largest cancer risk in the nation and the highest rates of death from cancer in the nation. These Louisianans are also disproportionately killed by the COVID-19 pandemic due to poor lung health. See attachment. As lung health is critical to sustaining a workforce and avoiding force majeure during the pandemic, the committee must review the health benefits of different methods of reducing carbon impacts so that the state should choose the emission drawdown solutions with the largest co-benefits to the state's health and thus the state's economy. The EPA BIDMAP method is the simplest method to accomplish this analysis, and he provides a link to BIDMAP. Scott continues, these risks and health impacts should be evaluated for how they are intimately connected with the fact that local business growth has declined in the river parishes where most petrochemical development and most climate emissions have occurred, according to the U.S. Small Business Administration. Residents in the river parishes need their lung health to create and run small businesses, which is the largest source of jobs in Louisiana. Local businesses in St. James, like Heimel Seafood, have only failed since the new core plant, among others, have expanded. Donaldsonville and Plaquemine are rotten with national chains and have almost no small businesses along their main streets, ensuring the wealth of Louisiana is exported elsewhere. Giving river parishes their lung health will likely be the fastest and most effective way to draw down climate emissions, and we hope this committee takes the sociological environmental justice frame seriously. Additionally, this committee must recognize that Black and Indigenous Louisianans have suffered due to the erasure of their cultural sites, i.e. cemeteries and grave sites, during the eras of colonialization and the Jim Crow era. LED must fund genealogical and historic investigations before advertising climate emitting sites are ready as construction. We require this committee respect the legal requirements for those investigations under NHPA and the great needs for these kinds of research to preserve the culture of Louisiana against the forces of a changing climate and rising seas. This committee must recommend these actions for the state's economy to be developed, but they will also assist plants in becoming more valuable to companies looking to excise stranded assets. Louisianans deserve an economy that serves them instead of one that hires Texans for the profits of Saudi Arabia. We look forward to the task force's recommendations as a way for Louisiana's economy for our own residents rather than for the nation. For a healthy Gulf, signed Scott Eustace. Our third comment is also from Scott Eustace at Healthy Gulf. And this comment reads, the issue of orphan wells permanently, in quote, shut in for future use and abandoned wells appear to be missing from the LSU greenhouse gas report. Louisiana legislative auditor has provided a summary of orphan wells, but not other categories of wells that are likely to leak methane. All wells are likely to leak over the course of their life, and Louisiana has hundreds of thousands of oil and gas wells. The cement casings on these wells needs review once every 30 years. Louisiana is littered with abandoned wells as well as wells that have been, in quote, shut in for future use for decades longer than my lifetime. Future use is obviously specious. These wells must be reviewed for methane emissions every 30 years and sealed against methane emissions. The Manufacturing Industry Committee should recommend the abolition of the shut-in future use category for oil wells that have not been used in 10 years. Despite industry's promise of tens of thousands of jobs, the oil industry has laid off tens of thousands of workers from Louisiana since the rise of fracking in 2013. There are many Louisianans idled by the oil industry with some oil field experience and sometimes much oil field experience. Since 2013, most of them have had to leave the state to work. Reviewing and plugging these orphan wells is an obvious program to hire these oil workers to work within Louisiana rather than Texas or North Dakota and ensure that methane leaks are kept at a minimum. The committee should conduct a sociological and greenhouse gas review of an action to hire back Louisiana oil workers to our state from oil fields in other states to review and stop methane leaks. Signed, Scott Eustace. We have another comment from Scott Eustace at Healthy Gulf, which reads, the LSU and LED greenhouse gas report omits the former wetland forests that have been converted into sand mines. It discusses former coal mines, but not former sand mines. Attached are government studies, and I'll provide this attachment for members, including a previous governor's task force on these issues as a cause of flash flooding along the Amite River, including Denham Springs. The LDEQ and other initiatives were to reduce pollution and control flooding from the mines, but wetland restoration and wetland reforestation is a powerful carbon sequestration technique. The LDNR has a small department to study this issue from a safety perspective, but it is vastly overwhelmed and underfunded. These mines are concentrated on the Amite, Tangipahoa, and Bogachita rivers, and even within our scenic rivers, and have removed tens of thousands of acres of forested wetlands, some of Louisiana's greatest tools to sequester carbon and mitigate flooding. The acreage for these coastal wetlands is in the tens of thousands, smaller, but on a scale, the marsh restoration projects currently in the state's master plan. Restoration of these mines to wetland forests is an extremely cost-effective way to sequester carbon in coastal forest wetlands. Real estate interests to date have been opposed to this wetland restoration despite the flood risk benefits to people and houses on the real estate. The state and the Army Corps are considering the Darlington Dam, which is dangerous for St. Helena and Livingston Parish communities, including Denham Springs, but will also preclude much of this wetland forest restoration by covering those wetlands in water for the purpose of real estate development. We request the Manufacturing and Industry Committee review the wetland forest restoration potential in the Amite, Tangipahoa, and Bogachita rivers in accordance with the Louisiana Scenic Rivers Act, and work with mine owners to restore abandoned mines to floodplain forest. We request this committee review the USACE Darlington Dam Project, Amite River and Tributaries Project, and explore wetland carbon sequestration as an alternative. Signed, Scott Eustace from Healthy Gulf. And members, I'll provide the attachments on that one as well. And Scott's last comment reads, please see the attached fault lines, a study and breakdown of stranded assets, vulnerabilities of carbon emitting companies by company. Many of these companies are the source of carbon emissions in Louisiana, part of the 49% identified by LAD LSU. Shell Convent was allowed to expand pollution and emissions in 2015, becoming less efficient. Such inefficiency allowed by LDEQ put that facility first in line to be severed from Shell's assets, as the company sought to maintain financial solvency, resulting in the unemployment of hundreds of Louisiana residents and a lowering of state and parish budgets. Louisiana must review these pollution sources in terms of their ability to be cut from a multinational portfolio, as the out-of-state companies deal with their stranded assets. The Manufacturing and Industry Committee should identify the stranded asset issue as worthy of study by the task force. Most or all of manufacturing in Louisiana is owned by entities outside of the state, and these entities will be looking globally to shed assets in order to become solvent. This issue is critical to address in order to avoid any more of Louisiana's facilities being shut down to maintain multinational priorities. For a Healthy Gulf, signed, Scott. Our next comment is from Jane Patton of No Waste Louisiana, and her comment reads, Dear Committee, having now watched several of the task force public meetings, a distinct pattern is emerging in the context of the discussion. It is clear that this task force sees technologies around carbon capture, storage, and sequestration as a viable strategy for averting damage to the climate and Louisiana's people and environment. But CCSS is not at all a solution to the crisis we are in, and Louisiana's people, environment, and economy will suffer debilitating harm if this discourse is allowed to continue. The health, welfare, and safety of Louisiana's people should be centered in all recommendations coming out of this committee and others. Members of this committee must be straightforward and upfront about how their industries affect people's real lives across the entire and cumulative emission profile. These facts should give the task force serious pause in relying on any CCSS technology as a solution in any of its objectives. According to a comprehensive analysis of all forms of geoengineering, including CCSS, published in 2019 by the Center for Environmental Law, in quote, all pathways that avoid overshooting 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming require an early rapid phase out of fossil fuels. Implementing CCSS technology in Louisiana does not contribute to a phase out of fossil fuels. Instead, it perpetuates them. That entire report should be required reading for everyone on this task force and in the governor's office. The oil and gas industry is failing. Over 15,000 workers have lost jobs in the industry just in this year, 2020. And leaning on technologies that give a crutch to a dying industry is not a sound financial investment for our state. The petrochemical and manufacturing industries are also floundering, with 2 final investment decisions for petrochemical manufacturers officially delayed, including one in Louisiana for Mosa Plastics. Again, conversations around reducing greenhouse gas emissions in manufacturing and industry in Louisiana should be about phasing out CO2 emitting industries and instead investing in renewable and sustainable production and growth. The technologies for carbon capture and especially storage are still highly theoretical, and by the industry's own estimates are 5 to 10 years from meaningful deployment. Whereas the technologies needed for Louisiana to immediately phase out fossil fuels already exist and should urgently be deployed across the state. Thank you, signed Jane Patton. Our next comment is from Logan Atkinson Burke of the Alliance for Affordable Energy. And her comment reads, "Hello, I'd like to urge this committee to put efficiency at the top of your list for solutions to reducing existing emissions across the industrial sector, which is a leader both in emissions and electricity usage. A significant amount of energy in the industrial sector is wasted to heat across our state. In fact, according to research by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in 2018, nearly half of the energy that went into the industrial sector in the state was wasted as rejected energy, largely as heat. This means there is a real opportunity to capture that rejected energy for use in generating electricity that could be used not only by the industrial class, but by the rest of the state. Combined heat and power, or CHP, is technology that has existed for decades and presents a way to effectively both reduce emissions and feed the need for electricity. This committee should collaborate with the Power Subcommittee to discuss ways to encourage greater adoption of combined heat and power while the sector continues to use fossil fuels in the short term." Signed, Logan Atkinson Burke. Our next comment is from Andy Kowalski, and his comment reads, it's regarding agenda item 8 in the objectives. And it reads, "Decarbonizing the industrial sector is going to be the most important task related to the overall reduction of greenhouse gases in Louisiana. Important not only because of the volume and share of greenhouse gas emissions in the industrial and manufacturing, but also because there are critical, important decisions about how to proceed forward that could lead to long-lasting environmental or financial impacts. Deciding what course to follow should be dependent on doing a serious analysis of the environmental risk impacts of carbon capture sequestration technology. When weighing the cost of carbon capture sequestration technology, it's important to consider the immediate cost in terms of environmental impact. The challenges related to transportation of CO2 often have very serious environmental impacts. In February of 2020, this was apparent in the recent accident that happened in Yazoo County, Mississippi. The following is taken from an article in the Clarion Ledger, who reported on a blowout caused by a pipeline owned by the company Denbury Resources. And this reads, "A sheriff's investigator who rescued people from their homes and cars after an oil and gas company pipeline ruptured in Yazoo County Saturday said the sick were acting like zombies. In the middle of rescuing people, the deputy also got sick. The pipeline, which ruptured around 7 p.m. Saturday in a heavily wooded area off Mississippi 433 near Citeria, contained carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, according to the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency. When the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality later tested the air quality on site, they found carbon dioxide. When this committee moves forward in discussing solutions to decarbonize the industrial sector, it is critically important to consider the environmental and health risk related to a strategy based on carbon capture and sequestration. To overlook events like the Denbury blowout in Mississippi is to force communities across Louisiana to bear undue risk. Furthermore, to suggest that permitting should be expedited for CCUS projects is to enhance the risk of incidents like the Denbury blowout. The challenge of decarbonizing industry and manufacturing is time limited. In that respect, we need to make strategic decisions. Investing in carbon sequestration technologies that are not commercially scalable and have low efficiency in terms of percentage of carbon mitigation, even when subsidized by the federal government through a 45Q tax credit, is a path that would be hard to pivot from. There's financial risk in these solutions as well. Consider the clean coal carbon sequestration project at the Kemper coal plant in Mississippi, which ran into cost overruns over $7 billion. This technology is not cost effective and should not be subsidized unless there's a clear path to market competitiveness. When thinking about this undertaking, we need to think about how to pave a solid foundation for decarbonization. Electrification, voltage control, and combined heat and power technologies can all play important roles, along with demand reduction and efficiency gains in manufacturing. But they need to be planned for. Furthermore, they can provide a net increase of jobs if that in turn is planned for as well. If you're going to build a zero emission manufacturing and industrial sector, you need to lay down the proper foundation. If there's financial and environmental risk overwhelmingly allocated to carbon sequestration, there will be a lower likelihood of meeting goals. The answer is to consider technologies that are commercially available and plan over time how to implement those at scale. In summation, please consider the whole picture around decarbonization and what the risk profile of different technologies are. This is how the committee should define transition risk. Signed, Andy Kowalski of MISO, South Grasstops Campaign Coordinator. And members, I believe that is all of our comments. Yes, that is all of our comments, and I'll pass it back over to the chairs.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, everybody, it brings us to the end. Our final item is to adjourn. So with that, I would like to take a second to thank everybody for very interesting discussions and very useful discussions, and for taking your time to join us today. Tim, would you like to say something before we go? Tim?
I'm sorry.
Would you like to say a word before we go?
No, not really. Just to say, I really appreciate everyone's comments, cooperation, involvement. Looks like we have the right group here, the right team. I can't say enough about Lindsay and Harry, the work that you do in preparation for these meetings. Thank you so very much, and we look forward to a great result. So thank you all.
Yep. Thank you, Harry and Lindsay. And with that, we'll look for a motion to adjourn. Anyone?
So moved. I move.
A second. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Y'all have a good rest of the day and a good week. Thank y'all.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good rest of the day.